If you're proud to be an American, put your hands up now. It was the night after the inauguration, and I was in Washington, D.C., playing a free show for 10,000 Obama for America volunteers. It was the cap of a euphoric and surreal few months when the entire history of the world that I'd known up to that point totally flipped. The words proud to be an American were not words I'd ever thought I'd say. I'd written America off, at least politically. Of course, it's my home and home to millions of people trying to do the right thing, not to mention the home of hip hop, Quentin Tarantino flicks, the crossover dribble, and lots of other things I couldn't live without. But politically, its history is a travesty, a graveyard, and I knew some of the bodies it buried. It never seemed as hopeless as it was during the 8 years that preceded that night in Washington. I was so over America that if John McCain and Sarah Palin had won that election, I was seriously ready to pack up, get some land in some other country, and live as an expat in protest. The idea of starting a show that way would have been, at any other time in my entire life up to that point, completely perverse. Because America, as I understood the concept, hated my black ass. Fuck government, niggas politic themselves. Poor people in general have a twisted relationship with the government. We are aware of the government from the time we're born. We live in government funded housing and work government jobs. We have family and friends spending time in the ultimate public housing, prison. We grow up knowing people who pay for everything with little plastic cards, Medicare cards for checkups, EBT cards for food. We know what AFDC and WIC stand for, and we stand for hours waiting for bricks of government cheese. The 1st and 15th of each month are times of peak economic activity. We get to know all kinds of government agencies, not because of civics class, but because they actually visit our houses and sit up on our couches asking questions. From the time we're small children, we go to crumbling public schools that tell us all we need to know about what the government thinks of us. Then there are the cops. In places like Marcy, there are people who know the ins and outs of government bureaucracies, police procedures, and sentencing guidelines. Who spend half of their lives in dirty waiting rooms on plastic chairs waiting for someone to call their name. But for all of this involvement, the government might as well be the weather because a lot of us don't think we have anything to do with it. We don't believe we have any control over this thing that controls us. A lot of our heroes, almost by default, were people who tried to dismantle or overthrow the government. Malcolm X or the Black Panthers, or people who tried to make it completely irrelevant, like Marcus Garvey, who wanted black people to sail back to Africa. The government was everywhere we looked, and we hated it. Housing projects are a great metaphor for the government's relationship to poor folks. These huge islands built mostly in the middle of nowhere, designed to warehouse lives. People are still people. People are still people, though, so we turned the projects into real communities, poor or not. We played in fire hydrants and had cookouts and partied, music bouncing off concrete walls. But even when we could shake off the full weight of those imposing buildings and try to just live, the truth of our lives and struggle was still invisible to the larger country. The rest of the country was freed of any obligation to claim us, which was fine because we weren't really claiming them either. Can't see the unseeable, reach the unreachable. Hip hop, of course, was hugely influential in finally making our slice of America visible through our own lens, not through the lens of outsiders. But it wasn't easy. There are all famous incidents of censorship and intimidation, the way politicians attack rappers, the free speech cases with groups like Two Live Crew, the drama surrounding Public Enemy and political rap, the threatening letters from the FBI protesting NWA. But the attempts at censorship only made the targets bigger stars. NWA couldn't have bought the kind of publicity they got from having the actual fucking FBI attacking them over a song. This was when you had one prominent Harlem pastor renting a bulldozer and calling news cameras to film him running over a pile of rap CDs in the middle of 125th Street. When WBLS, a legendary black owned radio station in New York, stripped hip hop from their playlists in sympathy with the protests. Another radio station, Hot 97, came along with an all rap format and went straight to number one. In a few years, WBLS came back to rap. In the end, you can't censor the truth, especially when it comes packaged in hot music. Those battles were big for all of us in hip hop and offered an important survival lesson. Politicians at the highest levels would try to silence and kill our culture if they could hustle some votes out of it. Even black leaders who were supposed to be representing you would turn on you, will pile your records up and run over them with a fucking bulldozer, or try to ban you from radio if they felt threatened by your story or language. But the thing is, we kept winning. The push for censorship only reinforced what most of us already suspected. America doesn't want to hear about it. There was a real tension between the power of the story we wanted to tell and just how desperately some powerful people didn't want to hear it. But the story had to come out sooner or later because it was so dramatic, important, crazy, and just plain compelling. Back in the 80s and early 90s, cities in the country were literally battlegrounds. Kids were as well Kids were as well armed as a paramilitary outfit in a small country. Teenagers had Uzis, German Glocks, and assault rifles. And we had accessories too, like scopes and silencers. Guns were easier to get in the hood than public assistance. There were times when the violence just seemed like background music, like we'd all gone numb. The deeper causes of the crack explosion were in policies concocted by a government that was hostile to us, almost genocidally hostile when you think about how they aided or tolerated the unleashing of guns and drugs on poor communities, while at the same time cutting back on schools, housing, and assistance programs. And to top it all off, they threw in the so called war on drugs, which was really a war on us. There were racist new laws put in the books, like the drug laws that penalized the possession of crack cocaine with more severe sentences than the possession of powder. Three strike laws could put young guys in jail for 25 years for nonviolent crime. The disease of addiction was treated as a crime. The rate of incarceration went through the roof. Police abuses and corruption were rampant. Across the country, cops were involved in the drug trade, playing both sides. Young black men in New York in the 80s and 90s were gunned down by cops for the lightest sus- suspected offenses or died in custody under suspicious circumstances. And meanwhile, we were killing ourselves by the thousands. Almost 20 years after the fact, there are studies that say between 1989 and 1994, more black men were murdered in the streets of America than died in the entire Vietnam War. America did not want to talk about the human damage or the deeper causes of the carnage. But then here came rap, like the American nightmare come to life. The disturbing shit you thought you locked away for good, buried at the bottom of the ocean, suddenly materialized in your kid's bedroom, laughing it off, cursing loud, and grabbing its nuts, refusing to be ignored anymore. I'm America's worst nightmare. I'm young, black, and holding my nuts like, yeah. Hardcore rap wasn't political in an explicit way, but its volume and urgency kept a story alive that a lot of people would have preferred to disappear. Our story, it scared a lot of people. We told guns to the Grammys. Invisibility was the enemy, and the fight had multiple fronts. For instance, 1998 was an important year for hip hop. It was 2 years after Pac had been gunned down and just a year after Biggie was killed. DMX dropped two number one albums that year. Outkast released Aquemini, a game-changing album lyrically and sonically, but also for what it meant to Southern rap. Juvenile's 400 Degrees, also released in '98, was a major shot in the growing New Orleans movement. I jumped on a remix of his single, Huh, which was a great mix of regional styles. Most Def and Talib Kweli had their Black Star album, one of the definitive indie rap records of all time. The prototypical backpack rappers, A Tribe Called Quest, released their last album, The Love Movement. The biggest album of the year, in any genre was the miseducation of Lauryn Hill. It was a beautiful time all the way around in hip hop. The album I released that year, Volume 2, Hard Knock Life, was the biggest record of my life. The opening week was unreal for me. We did more than 300,000 units, by far the biggest opening number of my career to that point. The album moved Lauryn Hill down to number 4. The Outkast's Aquemini was right behind me. The Love Movement was number 3. Those 4 albums together told the story of young Black America from 4 dramatically different perspectives. We were bohemians and hustlers and revolutionaries and space age Southern cowboys or Southern boys. We were funny and serious, spiritual and ambitious, lovers and gangsters, mothers and brothers. This was the full picture of our generation. Each of these albums was an innovative and honest work of art and wildly popular on the charts. Every kid in the country had at least one of these albums, and a lot of them had all 4. The entire world was plugged into the stories that came out of the specific struggles and creative explosion of our generation. And that was just the tip of the iceberg of what was happening in hip hop that year. So, in this incredible year for diverse strands of real hip hop, what happens at the Grammy Awards? First, DMX with 2 number 1 albums and a huge single, Get At Me Dog, that brought rap back to its grimy roots, was completely snubbed. And then in this year, when rap dominated the charts and provided the most innovative and creative music you could find on the radio, they decided not to televise any of the rap awards. Rap music was fully coming into its own creatively and commercially, but still being treated as if it wasn't fit to sit in the company of the rest of the music community. I was nominated 3 times that year, but when they told us they weren't televising our awards, I decided to stay home. It wasn't a big deal, formal boycott. God knows there were bigger issues in the world, and eventually I started coming to the show and even performing, but not until they started showing rap the respect it deserves. The larger point was I wasn't going to be a partner to my own invisibility. Crooked officer, why you want to see me in a coffin, sir? When the politicians can't censor you and the industry can't marginalize you, call the cops. The statistics on the incarceration of Black men, particularly of men of my generation, are probably the most objective indication that young Black men are seen in this country as a problem that can be made to literally disappear. No one in the entire world, not in Russia or China or Iran, is locked up like Black men are locked up in this country. I had to deal with the cops when I was hustling, and that made sense. I had to deal with the cops before that too, because even before I started running the streets, I was on their radar just because of who I was. But when I was done with the streets and done with my one major brush with law enforcement, after I left the streets, I still wasn't done with 5-0. One night, I was at Baseline with my man Tone from Trackmasters, working on the song that would become Izzo, Hova, on the Blueprint album. I left the studio to run by Club Exit in Midtown because I had promised Ja Rule that I'd come by and join him for our big hit, Can I Get Up? I went to the club, performed the song, and then 10 minutes later I left. I hopped in my Suburban with Ty, and my bodyguard and the driver pulls off. We were 1 block away from the club when an unmarked police van cuts us off, like in a movie. Since there's a limo partition in the SUV, it took me a few minutes to see what was happening, but it sounded like a raid. Sirens flashing, cops yelling. When I lifted the partition, I saw a half a dozen squad cars surrounding us. My bodyguard was already out of the car, and a detective was showcasing his gun up in the air like he had found something. But my bodyguard claimed the gun and showed them his license. I was in the back seat laughing because they were so overdoing it. But the next thing I knew, someone was opening my door and putting their hands on me, trying to drag me out of the car and make me turn around. I tried to talk to them. You know this isn't necessary. He has a license. He claimed the weapon. What's the problem? The cop looked back at me with that shut up nigga screw face. But I could tell he was confused. This wasn't going as planned. He asked his partner what he should do. Right in front of me, his partner made a call and explained the situation to whoever was on the other end. I got JayZ, he said on the phone, with a sense of accomplishment. Then he told his man to arrest me. I was dumbstruck as they loaded me into the back of the cruiser like a prize catch. When they got me to the precinct for questioning, I saw a giant pegboard, the sort you've seen before in police television shows and and movies. On the pegboard were organizational charts of rappers like you have for a major crime organization like the mafia, but for rappers. Once they had me, they made me do the perp walk. The police escorted stroll in public, which meant dragging me in front of all the photographers outside the precinct. The charges were dropped, of course. It clearly wasn't my weapon, but they made sure to humiliate me first. With my other case still pending, this would help paint the picture of me as a menace to society. If I were just a fan or a casual observer of hip hop and you told me the NYPD had created a squad or division to deal with rappers, I'd laugh in your face. But it's clear now that hip hop police existed. There have been some media investigations and even a public admission by one prominent detective, the so called hip hop cop. Dossiers was created on rappers and their associates. Cops staked out shows and nightclubs and followed rappers in broad daylight. The hip hop cop stayed outside the club I was in. Every time I walked into a club, he'd joke with me. You got a gun? I would fuck with him right back. Do you? For 7 years, that cop was there at every club, every show. But I still have to ask myself why. Rappers as a class are not engaged in anything criminal. They're musicians. Some rappers and friends of rappers commit crimes. Some bus drivers commit crimes. Some accountants commit crimes, but there aren't task force devoted to bus drivers or accountants. Bus drivers don't have to work under the preemptive suspicion of law enforcement. The difference is obvious, of course. Rappers are young black men telling stories that the police, among others, don't want to hear. Rappers tend to come from places where police are accustomed to treating everybody like a suspect. The general style of rappers is offensive to a lot of people, but being offensive is not a crime, at least not one that's on the books. The fact that law enforcement treats rap like organized crime tells you a lot about just how deeply rap offends some people. They'd love for rap itself to be a crime, but until they get that law passed, they come after us however they can. Sometimes it's surprising to find out who's trying to put the invisibility cloak on you. It's one thing when it comes from the government or from the people in the larger music industry who are trying to keep niggas in their place, but it's harder to take coming from other artists. In 2008, I was invited to play at the Glastonbury Festival in England. I took the gig because it was a chance to knock some doors down for the culture. It's a huge festival, one of the largest outdoor festivals in the world. It started in the 70s and mostly featured rock music, even though the definition of rock music wasn't always clear. What do Massive Attack, Radiohead, and Arctic Monkeys, Bjork, and the Pet Shop Boys really have in common? Well, there's one thing: none of them rap. When it was announced that I'd be headlining Glastonbury, Noel Gallagher of Oasis said, "I'm not having hip hop in Glastonbury. It's wrong." That quote that went around, "I'm not having hip hop," says a lot. Like he had a veto. But kids today have a mix of songs from all over the place in their iPods, and they take pride in it. There is no rock music with walls around it. It's one of the great shifts that happened over my lifetime. That particular culture has managed to shake free of the constraints that still limit us in so many other parts of life. It's an open field. As planned, I played that show in front of 180,000 people. I stood backstage with my crew and we looked out at the crowd. It wasn't like any other crowd I'd played. There were tens of thousands of people staring up at the stage, but it might as well have been a million. Bodies covered my entire field of vision. We were under a dark, open sky. Their cheers and chants were like a tidal wave of sound crashing over the stage. It was awesome and a little ominous. Before I came out, we played a video intro reel about the controversy that included Gallagher's quote that I had fucking no chance of pulling off Glastonbury. Then I walked out on stage with an electric guitar hanging around my neck and started singing Oasis's big hit, Wonderwall. It went over big. Then I toured through my set with my band. A band, by the way, that's as rock as any band in the world. The show was amazing. One of the highlights of my career. It was one of those moments that taught me that there really is no limit to what hip hop could do. No place that was close to its power. My purposefully fucked up version of Wonderwall put it back on the charts a decade after it came out, ironically. The whole sequence felt familiar to me. That same sense of someone putting their hands and weight on me, trying to push me back to the margins, telling me to be quiet, not to get into the frame of their pristine picture. It's the story of my life and the story of hip hop. But the beautiful thing at Glastonbury was that when I opened with Wonderwall, over 100,000 voices rose up into the dark sky to join mine. It was a joke, but it was also kind of beautiful. And then when I segued into 99 Problems, 100,000 voices rocked the chorus with me. To the crowd, it wasn't rock and rap or a battle of genres, it was music.